All right, so AOUSD is really amazing that this was launched. It was definitely the talk of SIGGRAPH. I think we're super lucky to have someone who we all know very well, Guy Martin from NVIDIA here, who's doing open source and standards there, but also, I mean, did an incredible amount of work to launch AOUSD and is on the board there now. So he's going to give us a quick brief, and then we're really hoping to do just a lot of engaged Q&A. Nick from Pixar is also here to handle the tech questions
Yay,
and the
Nick.
spec questions. So Nick, great to see you. So Guy, with that said, I'll stop the screen share and over to you.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody. I appreciate the chance to be here. I've only got a few slides just to kind of give us a little perspective if you haven't heard or if you kind of want to see where we are. So I'll send out the briefing deck. I'd mentioned to Patrick, I'll send out the briefing deck for this so you have kind of the whole picture, but I just want to pick a few slides to kind of give us some context. So you probably heard from the announcement, right? It's the 5 founding companies listed here. And when we pick this slide and put it together, I think it's good because it kind of goes to the motivations for each of the companies. Obviously, NVIDIA, interested that we do gaming, interested, I think, really from the industrial metaverse side. Autodesk from M&E and some AECO, Apple from XR and e-commerce, Adobe from creatives, and then Pixar representing the VFX and M&E spaces. So I think it's a great mix of those 5 companies. It's also, when we had this discussion, and some of you may know the backstory, it was 10 plus months of negotiations and discussions, and as you can imagine, to put something like this together, I think what came out of it is these 5 companies are also the ones who've done a significant amount of work to not only shepherd but also move USD forward. So I think we're really excited about that group. And I should also point out that there are 7 general members that joined, including you folks at Cesium. Patrick, thank you. Epic, Mark, great to have you folks on board. Foundry, Hexagon, IKEA, Side Effects, and Unity. And one thing I kind of want to get up front, maybe postpone a question here, is a lot of people say, well, what about X or company X or company Y? And the reality is, right, to get, as you can imagine, get something like this launched, we had to basically at some point cut off and say, okay, we're going to go ahead and do the launch. But by no means does that mean we don't want additional companies who are interested in coming on board to help us with this to join. I think that it's an open organization. We want companies who are interested and who want to help us drive the standard to come on board. So moving forward to kind of the why open standards, I like to say this is kind of the slide that marketing put together, and it's all great. It's kind of buzzwordy, but I think what it comes down to for us, right, from a practical standpoint, is 2 big reasons. One, we're at a point where USD is becoming very close to something in cooperation with glTF that will be kind of the standard way that we talk about 3D. And so with that, you are likely to end up potentially having alternate implementations, and that's good. We actually think that that's a great thing to have alternate implementations in different languages, different technology stacks, but that we want those to be compatible. So the compatibility is a big piece. And then frankly, the other piece of it from a business and strategy perspective is companies want to build their business on this. They want to know this is a standard that's going to be around and it's going to be maintained and it's not going to fracture, and it's going to have the imprimatur of a lot of companies coming together to work together on it. So that's kind of my spiel on the why the open standards piece. A lot of folks have said, why did you take it to the Joint Development Foundation? There's a lot of good places that we could have taken this. I think the big thing that we saw here, and two of the reasons we wanted to do it, were that it gave us the ability to define a pretty flexible governance model. And having been involved in open source and standards for a long time, I've seen, you've probably all seen too, 3-year death marches to get to a spec. And that's not what we intend to do here. So having a flexible governance model lets us build out what we need to build out, but also having the rigor in place that the Joint Development Foundation at the Linux Foundation gives us that rigor and a path to ISO, right? I think it's a really important piece of this. We believe that just like HTML or PDF or any of these other standards, we need to get something that can become an international standard and be widely recognized. So that's kind of the path of why we did it that way. Let's see, don't want to talk about the mission piece. I kind of want to talk about the structure because a lot of people have asked about this. So right now there's only one working group, And Nick, I want to give Nick a quick second to talk about that in a minute. The core specification working group is the first thing that got started, right? It's defining what is the core of USD and letting us kind of build on top of that for additional working groups to kind of put together ancillary standards that ride on top of the core specification working group. There's a steering committee, and Patrick mentioned I'm the representative from the NVIDIA side. I'll show you the rest of those folks in a second. And then the usual things you would expect. We didn't mention legal. If there's a legal working group, there's a marketing working group. I think the important thing to note is that we do plan to have future working groups. There's been a lot of discussion, as some of you can imagine, on what that would look like. We're trying to be relatively conservative because we want the core specification working group to get up and running and get their work going before we start sort of subdividing, especially resources, because there's a lot of common people here. We don't want to have 15 working groups and none of them are getting any work done. So I think we're being pretty cautious, but we're looking at the obvious ones you would think of, right? Things like materials, things like security and some others that are kind of the low-hanging fruit. What are we actually planning on delivering, I think, is another key thing that people have asked us about. Obviously, standard specifications, formal written specifications that are going to be royalty-free. I think it's a really important thing here. We're using W3C patent mode, but the specifications that come out of this are going to be royalty-free, right? That's a super, super important piece of this that we wanted as we put the governance model together. The plan is to do some open source tooling so that there will be the ability to run a compliance and compatibility suite and verify alternate implementations other than the current one at Pixar that are compatible with the standard. And then finally, a place to have community resources, industry expert groups to come and talk about, what things needed to be added to USD and what things need to be part of the future. But with that said, one of the things that a lot of people have asked is, okay, well, what about all the work going on at ASWF? And we think that's fantastic. So for existing places where in the visual effects and media and entertainment space, there are already great industry working groups and practicing working groups going on. The intent from the very beginning was to make sure we're not going to try to do all of this ourselves, right? We are pursuing currently liaison relationships with Kronos, with Academy Software Foundation, and with others, right? The intent here is for us to have a good ecosystem of other standards definition bodies and other consortiums that are already doing work in the USD ecosystem and figuring out how we leverage the other things that they're doing. And then finally, I'll leave you with this. Steve May, unfortunately, wasn't able to join us today, but obviously Steve is the chair of the steering committee. Very familiar names to most of you, probably Gordon and Guido. Travis, my counterpart at Apple. And we are at this point, with the way our activities are going, are meeting pretty much every week to kind of help, chart out the strategy of where we go in the next year. But with that, I will turn it over to Nick really briefly to talk about kind of the work they're doing in the core specification working group. And then we can open it up to questions. Nick.
All right. So the core specification working group is focused specifically on what's already there in OpenUSD as the core foundations of USD. So the working group is going to have as an outcome specification, and that's going to encompass a whole bunch of things. We're going to normatively specify data types and containers that you can use to build the various components of USD, which include SDF, which is the structured data definitions, and PCP, which is the algorithms for scene composition. We're going to specify file formats, the existing ones, USD A, C, and Z. We'll document the functional components of the various libraries to the degree that you can understand how to fully compose a scene, given what it references, how it references, what the different layers are, and so on. The metadata will be laid out such as is necessarily standardized across things. The metadata, or the meta schema that describes the schemas for USD, because USD schemas themselves are described by USD schemas, that there'll be enough in the specification that you can look at a meta schema and understand how to compose it into a schema, and then use that schema further to interpret data in USD files. All of the resolution algorithms like liver Ps will be fully laid out. We'll talk about expressions and codeless schemas and versioning. And the kinds of things that won't be in the domain of what the core specification working group does are, we won't be talking about extending the core functionality. Schemas that are application or domain oriented, like possibly lighting or geometry or materials. And those are applications of USD and not foundational, so they won't be in the core. We won't be inventing new things or improving the existing functionality, but anything that we come across along those lines will report as, hey, we found a bug, but it won't be within the domain of the group to address that. Nor will we, I don't think we'll document bugs as like existing bad things forever. So hopefully we won't actually come across things like that. But things that are in progress on USD proposals that aren't actually in the core might someday be part of a core specification, but they're going to be given their own time to mature without being forced by the work that the core working specification group is doing. I guess the other interesting factor is timeline. We're going to start our series of meetings next week, and we'll kick it off with people who've signed up to be part of that meeting to talk about the suggestion for what the domain of the group is, work out what are the timelines and who has expertise in what things. And hopefully it's going to be a smooth and enjoyable process from there.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. Yeah, that's great. That's perfect. That's exactly what I needed you to say, since you folks are involved with that. So, Patrick, we're open for questions. Anything, everything.
Nice. Well, first, thank both you guys. I see Leonard had his hand up right away. Leonard?
Yeah, so I was going to ask about the schedule, but Nick already jumped on that and said it's not defined yet, so that's fine. Is there plans to come out with some sort of public statement, either at a conference or some presentations, perhaps even here, on a regular basis to indicate how progress is going? Just not to bring out all the difficult and bad things that are happening, but just say, once every 6 months, we've achieved this far. We think our timelines are 3 years out or whatever it is, something like that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the TBD items, both in conjunction with our marketing working group, as well as Nick and Aaron Luck, who are co-chairs for the core specification working group. Obviously we're going to try to balance that. I don't want to have to put Nick and Aaron on the hook for, okay, every 2 weeks you need to be coming out and giving a public definition of where you are, right? There's a lot of milestones that they need help define and kind of sort that out. But yeah, I could imagine a situation where, again, in conjunction with the steering committee and the marketing working group, we say, hey, we'll do a 6-month update on where we are, right? I think, Nick, you can speak a little bit more to this, but I think the hope is from the steering committee side, right, we see kind of what the tentative milestones are going to look like for this by the end of the year, right? I mean, we're in September, end of September now, so I think being able to get that group, the core spec working group, together, and they need to lay out how they're going to do their work and what they kind of expect their timelines to be. Nick, is any other stuff on that?
The AOUSD forums are already open, of course. And we'll try to be responsive to questions like that in the forums as well. Even if somebody asks for a schedule and we don't have it, we'll just be frank about that and say, we're working on it, and we'll let you know as soon as we're all agreed.
Yeah. Kevin.
Hi. So a quick question about the core spec. So are any of the USD modules then considered to be part of the core spec? Some of the modules obviously not named USD, some are. The one I was thinking about right off the top was USD Scale. And I'm just wondering if any of those will be addressed by the core spec group or not.
Well, part of the work of the core spec group is to survey and list up what they all are and determine whether they are actually core. I would be rendering a guess about Scale. So I guess it's TBD by the committee. My guess that I would render is that it's application rather than the core is all about the things that you need to be able to describe things like USD Scale. because USD Scale builds on the other parts rather than being foundational. That's my guess.
Okay, great. I just wondered, since some of them seem to be associated with schemas as well as other modules, and so I wondered if that was part where that bubble will land.
Yeah, there's a really interesting point about schemas, which is that once you're at the level of a USD Scale, the schema itself is determined in terms of USD. So if the USD core specification fully describes how a schema works, unless if there's some runtime correspondence to the contents of, say, USD Scale that modify how the scene graph works or how things are composed, the schema for USD Scale, being a USDA file, is probably the normative description of what USD Scale is. It's as fully and normatively specified as it can possibly be, because not only does it list up what it is with names and types and documentation, but it becomes a runtime component dynamically. The end. That's how I think those ones work.
Cool. Other questions?
So, Guy, Nick, maybe a broad question. I mean, as you guys know, coming on these calls every 2 weeks, I mean, we have a pretty amazing group of people, a pretty wide swath of the industry. Like, I mean, how can we help?
Oh, well, first of all, I think it's great to have Tom, so I'll get to you in a second. I think it's great to have the conversations here. I think especially as we start thinking about the role glTF plays, right? I mean, I think, and Patrick, you know, we were at SIGGRAPH, and Aaron and I came to the glTF meeting to sort of make sure that we had an adequate representation from the AOUSD side. I think everyone has, not everyone, a significant number of people have tried to pit glTF and USD against each other. And I think actually our plan with AOUSD is and this working group is to, you know, make that not the thing, right? Make that something that we're not fighting with each other about it, right? We figure out where synergistically we work together. And I think that's what we need from this group is more help on those things. And then obviously, you know, if your companies want to come join and help work on the standardization effort, both in core and future working groups, that would be fantastic. Nick, do you have anything to add?
The thing that I would have to add is that glTF has a specification, and as USD has a specification, it'll give us a really concrete point where we can actually point at two different things and say, how are they same or how are they different? And we won't be rendering opinions or diving into code and trying to figure out. We'll just be able to say, oh, hey, look, they're exactly the same here and not there.
Thomas, go ahead.
Great.
Thank you. Yeah, you're kind of touching on my question also, but it had to do with, you know, how the Alliance is thinking about positioning the format with respects to glTF in particular. And I did catch Guido's talk at SIGGRAPH, and he gave some kind of good insights on that. But at the same time, I see Apple as a founding member there, and with USD set obviously. And I'm curious if maybe you can talk a little bit to how the Alliance is focusing, perhaps, or where the initial focus is going to be.
Well, I can't speak for Apple. We always have to say that. We can't speak for Apple, but I think Nick talked about, right, specifying the file formats is a big one. And I imagine that USDZ and the discussion about that and Apple's, you know, additions to that and Apple's, you know, take on that will be part of the discussion. It has to be. And it's a critical piece of it. I think the only thing I will say, oh yeah, thank you. Guido's talk was excellent. The only thing I will say is that from a personal standpoint, having done a couple of these, I've been very impressed with Apple's commitment to coming in and being open and having discussions, even if we don't always agree on things. So I think that it's a positive sign, in my opinion. Nick, do you have other thoughts there?
No, well said.
So maybe another question from me is, you know, I love the pragmatic nature where AOUSD is focusing both on specification, but also maybe some core kind of open source and ecosystem. could you guys talk maybe a little bit about that, even as you look even maybe longer term?
Right. So, obviously there's one implementation of USD today, right? Or one canonical implementation at Pixar. And it's fantastic, right? And none of us would be here sitting here today talking about this had Pixar not made that investment and Pixar not had that code base. But I think what we have looked at in AOUSD is saying, okay, if we at some point want to add a new feature, right? Obviously, after Nick and Aaron and the core specification working group get their job done, if we say, hey, we want to add something new, and it maybe is something that Pixar, it's a ecosystem specific feature that just does not really fit into what Pixar wants to do. Having a place like AOUSD where we could say, hey, we'll have a reference implementation of this feature, this thing we want to add, is a good thing, right? And so having that place to do that and have reference implementations of new features that are not part of or may not ever become part of the Pixar code base is a good thing, right? I think it's a healthy thing. And then obviously, like I said, the intent is, when we build the compliance tooling, it should be open source. It just makes total sense under Apache, by the way. The kind of further argument towards that is people are saying, well, is there going to be a certification and compliance program, right? A badging program, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. And that's TBD, right? We haven't really discussed that, but I think the first step is definitely, as we get the specifications built, is building that open source tooling to allow people to, if they want to build an alternate implementation, they can run the tooling and see if they're compatible with the spec. So, Nick.
And just to add to that from a different perspective, you might ask the question, why would you want an alternative implementation? And the obvious one is, I'm just going to build USD again and do all the same things USD does. But in many ways, that doesn't necessarily make sense, because there is just so much to consider, and there's such an investment already in optimization and so on. But there's a really interesting case where there's real reasons why you might want to generate, for example, a USDA file from scratch using, essentially a printf style mechanism. We discourage that because if you're just concatenating strings together and then hoping that it's going to open up somewhere else, like, how can we help? We can't help. You just did something. But if, for example, you had an embedded device, like some really tiny edge device that needs to just generate streams of USD metadata that correspond to something that's happening on a stage or something, a physical stage, then if there's a normative specification, we can at least say, yes, indeed, you built your edge device such that it generates clean conformant files. And so that would enable a whole class of applications like remote sensing and things like that would otherwise just sort of be in an ad hoc realm.
Excellent.
Yeah, Leonard.
Is the specification or the format known, or will it be known as USD, OpenUSD, or something else?
Leonard, I knew I was going to be able to count on somebody for that question. That is a bit of TBD right now, only because there, as you can imagine, the negotiations to get the name done, to get the logo and everything together were interesting. I don't know, to be 100% honest. We don't know at this point, although I think, Nick, if you were to hazard a guess, would you folks be calling it the OpenUSD specification?
I would certainly hazard that guess.
Okay.
It
hasn't been decided, so
yeah, I would say that the file format is a USD file. The extensions are going to be as they are, not going to change to OpenUSD, because why would we do that? So I think that there's a space for OpenUSD and USD, but USD is a file format.
I would encourage you to be relatively quick about this and completely open as to what you're calling it. So at some point shortly down the line, there isn't confusion as to what people are actually referring to.
Yep. Agreed. Yep. I think I have that on our agenda for this week's steering committee meeting, as a matter of fact.
So maybe another question from me. Well, Nick, look, I loved your comment about the core specification group kind of focusing on taking what's there and then writing it down normatively and being smart about not getting sidetracked. I think that focus and commitment, that's how you get it done, right? Now, as folks, maybe even from other industries want to start to extend USD, like, are there parallel streams where people are experimenting and then maybe, in a year that can get considered, or have you guys thought through kind of how that might work?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the structure we've been talking about, that there's working groups, right, which create specifications. That's their job. And then there's this concept of expert group, we're calling it, could be TBD, name something else at some point. And that expert group would be kind of the concatenation of folks coming to talk specifically about, hey, we think we need XYZ additional features or changes to USD. That expert group would probably birth a actual working group to go build that, right? And Nick can correct me if I'm wrong here. The way I'm kind of envisioning this in my head is the bedrock is the core specification, right? And then you're going to have other specifications that for these other things that aren't in core, that kind of layer on top of, I don't know, it's a layer on top of maybe us next to. But I think the core specification is that foundation that has to be done before you can do any of those other specifications.
Yeah, I would expect that the core specification gives you the vocabulary to do everything else. And if it doesn't give you the vocabulary that you need, then we missed something important. And in terms of like general participation, there's work that is specification adjacent that you can find at ASWF and USD proposals, and those things are all appropriately where they need to be, or if not, they'll get moved around. Where does USD proposals ultimately live? TBD. All of those things will get sorted over time, with practicality as the driver.
Yeah, I think it's important to note there from a practicality standpoint. Hey, Ed, I see your question. I'll get you in a second. I saw David Marin on. Our intent is not to usurp what's going on in ASWF. There's a ton of fantastic work going on there, and it needs to continue to go on there, specifically for M&E and visual effects. And David just popped up, so I'm sure he will say something at some point. But our intent is not to usurp that. Any additional expert groups that are, industry specific for AECO, let's pick that for an example. We're totally okay with hosting those at AOUSD and letting the good work that's already going on in media and entertainment and visual effects happen where it's happening, right? Again, the intent of this is not to suck all the energy, for every possible part of USD into this. If the work is already going on there, it's having that really close working relationship. And obviously we're under the Linux Foundation, which I guess I should have pointed out at the beginning, was kind of another kind of main reason why we chose to do that, because we have a great working relationship with ASWF. They're in the same umbrella family as us. So David, did you want to add anything before I get to Ed?
I just want to support what you said. I think that there's a lot of work to do in open technologies in general, be it on open source or on specification, to really deliver on the benefits of working together on code. At the foundation, we're focused more on the code and the open source management of project itself. But as we've said many times now, that did not provide the next step for USD that was needed. So it made sense to do the AOUSD for that. And as you said, the Joint Development Foundation that you're drawing from for AOUSD is part of the Linux Foundation umbrella. The Linux Foundation has been really an incredible partner for our Academy Software Foundation and for helping our engineers in the film and TV industry to come out of the shadows with their open source projects and develop and grow. So they're the right partner to take on, I'm totally behind the Linux Foundation as a partner for our activities that we're all doing toward developing a platform in media where every company can come and work on things that benefit everyone. So that's the mission of the foundation, and it's totally aligned with what you're doing in both places, Guy, as you are board members in both places, like many of the AOUSD founders. So total alignment there, no problem.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it. Ed, go ahead.
So just going back to an earlier topic, Nick was talking about the creation of the specification and what happens if there's third-party software writing out USD files without going through a shared open source library that's already been vetted. One of the things we found on the glTF side that's critically important to us is having a validation tool. So I would encourage you to think about building a validation tool. And the main problem that solves is, package A writes a glTF file with its own homegrown writer. Package B tries to read the glTF file written by A and fails. Whose fault is it? Well, the validation tool can look at that file and say, does it match the spec? Does it follow all the rules we laid out? Does it hit any of the weird edge cases that we know cause a bunch of problems? And it can sort of definitively say, yes, package A wrote a valid file and B should be able to read it, or no, what package A wrote was invalid. And that's been a really important tool for us to have the format live without a standard one-size-fits-all reader-writer that everybody has to use the same writing software. We found that really useful. So if you're not already considering that, I would just suggest that.
Yeah, I think it falls into those compliance toolkit things that we were talking about. But Nick, do you want to add further to that, since that will probably be in the domain of you folks in CoreSpec?
I will add a bullet point to my talking points for the opening meeting on Monday that we should work closely with the validation team to make sure that we're lockstep there. Thank you for the call out.
Except
Sure. Yeah.
Other questions?
Ed, maybe if I could ask you a question here. I mean, going way back, thinking about glTF, is there other, advice or lessons learned, or if we went back 10 years ago and started over, anything else you think off the top of your head we should share?
Don't write the validation tool in Dart. Oof, sorry, didn't say that out loud. What else? What are the tools lessons learned? I'll have to really think about that. Having a robust ecosystem where a lot of different authors are contributing is really important. I think, having it up on GitHub where people can write their own issues, and ideally having good response times there. And, I'm one of the people who has not always had good response times when the community posts on that particular GitHub. So I'm not one to talk, but, being able to have a good response time for people who come with questions or concerns about the spec itself and being able to steer them in the right direction, I think that's really important. And Patrick, I think you personally probably set the tone for that out of the gate and did a great job of that. So I think that's probably an important aspect of it to have.
Cool.
Cool. Other questions, concerns, suggestions? I like that. Definitely. I don't want these to just be questions. So suggestions help point us in the right direction.
Guy, what about on the messaging and outreach side? Do you think we have all the right threads connected with Metaverse Standards Forum, AOUSD, and Kronos, and so on? Because there's got to be some great overlap for panels or anything else like that.
I think that's a great thing. I mean, I think I will tell you, the steering committee members are pretty involved. Like, several of us sit in the marketing working group meetings, specifically for making sure that we're aligned on that. And, I think just look at SIGGRAPH, right? Obviously the panel that Neil and Mark, and you and I were on, I think is a great testament to that. I don't see, and again, unless somebody else has a different opinion, I don't see there being any missed threads there. I think everyone's having the conversations that need to be had. Are they always the easiest conversations? No, but it's, having been involved in open source standards for a long time, these are conversations that I'd rather have the tough conversations in the open and, you know, get to a point where we either agree or we agree to disagree, and we figure out what that boundary is. To Nick's point, right? If you actually have a specification, a normative specification, we can figure out what that boundary is. I think the issue has always been at this point with USD and glTF is one of them has a normative spec that you can look at and one of them doesn't, right? And we're attempting to fix that.
Got it.
Hi everyone. I do have just kind of like a general question related to this work, and just a quick intro. I'm a technical artist working for Target and very interested in, how USD can benefit our pipeline. But one of the things I've found, even as a technical person, the barrier for entry to working with USD is pretty high, and I do love, thinking of it as an API and things of that nature. And as we kind of go into this work, is there anything of kind of breaking down that barrier of entry, or kind of like knowledge share, to kind of onboard, partners who may not come from that purely technical nature? Because we have an interest to contribute, but at the same time, it's like we don't have like a USD expert to necessarily kind of really get at the meat of being an active partner. So it's kind of like a general open question.
No, it's a great question. And I think, it falls into that bucket that I showed in my slide of community resources, right? I think we kind of made it that bucket because it could be an expert group. It's partially there's going to be a series coming out from our marketing working group around the why USD, how USD. Obviously, AOUSD has some of those. NVIDIA has some of those. Pixar has some of those. I think my overall vision of this at some point is to have almost that canonical place where you can kind of go and learn about USD. And then, if NVIDIA's got specific things about how USD works in Omniverse, we have that documentation. Pixar has theirs. But to your point, it'd be really nice if we could eventually kind of get a center of gravity around some of the knowledge-based things, right, that you're talking about, because I think that is another reason we started AOUSD, was to have that place to have that. Now, I say that, and I also know that it can be very challenging, especially with companies involved, when they want to own all of the knowledge around how to get started with USD, right? I kind of deal with this internally sometimes at NVIDIA. We have a lot of great knowledge on this. Pixar, you guys got great knowledge, and I think there's got to be some way where we carve out, kind of, Mike, to your point, the basics, or how do you get started? And then if you have more advanced topics, again, like how to use, USD and NVIDIA Omniverse for X, then obviously that makes sense to live with us. But kind of that core, how do you even get started with USD? I think it would be my goal eventually to have that reside in AOUSD.
No, yeah, I appreciate that, because as someone who's kind of gone through the Pixar, like, here's how to use it and here's the tutorials, it doesn't quite tell you, how do I apply these? How do I kind of maybe use some of these, like, these cases that you would in your data lake? Like, how do I modify it? How do I save it? So as someone, who knows they're there, and like, I feel like I've gone through it, I still feel like there's just more questions on how to, apply these and how some of this stuff works.
And I will give a plug for the forum, though. If you haven't already joined forum.aousd.org, I think that's a fabulous resource that you don't have to be a member of AOUSD. And that was very specific on our part. We wanted to, house that under the aegis of AOUSD, have us pay for it, the member companies pay for it, but make it open and have it basically replace what is USD interest group. Yeah. Nick, do you have anything else on that?
I'd say that we're kind of aware that the documentation that you can find at our website, at Pixar's website in particular, is sort of like, well, here's 3 sets of encyclopedias, enjoy. And we've recently hired a person who's dedicated to, first of all, making sure that you can understand how to navigate that stuff and that it's accurate and readable, but also looking at tutorial topics and things like that. So I'd say there's like just broad awareness that we all need to not only like do a better job, but pitch in and get to the place the guy's talking about.
I mean, I can imagine an expert group coming together of folks like yourself, Mike, that are like, hey, this is just too much stuff, right? This is to your point, Nick, 3 encyclopedias, and NVIDIA has the equivalent of 3 encyclopedias about how to use USD and Omniverse, which is great. But can we carve out enough of that encyclopedia to get people started and to give them kind of the answers to the questions you're asking, Mike.
Oh yeah, I appreciate that. Super helpful.
And I think over time, you're going to see like these expert groups like just kind of pitching in. Right now, the ASC and VES are working on issues around camera metadata, and probably like the best place to learn about camera metadata in USD is like, what does the SC have to say about it? And so they'll probably publish a white paper or a position paper at some point. And I think we'll just see more and more of that as people bring their own interests and domains to the party.
Yeah, I mean, and I can imagine a scenario where AOUSD not only has its own, kind of that core documentation we're talking about, but also has the canonical list of where to go, right? Oh, you want to see how it works at Pixar, go here. You want to see how it works at ASC, go here. You want camera metadata, you want to know how it works in Omniverse, go here, right? I think that would be, even if we had literally the table of contents plus enough of the kind of the core getting started stuff housed at AOUSD, it would at least be one place you could go and then figure out where the other places are. Kind of a curated list, if you will. Okay, other questions?
I think you guys covered a lot of ground, right? From the core spec to, documentation stuff to open source ecosystem. It's great. Did we miss anything?
I don't know. I mean, I always feel like I'm missing something because, again, the last 10 months of my life, 10 plus months of my life were taken up, helping get all this put together. And yeah, I would just, if we're gonna close, I would just close with saying, people like Nick and others at Pixar and Apple and the other people who were involved with this are, I've done a couple of these. This was probably, even though it was maybe the most challenging. Yeah, that's the one, Mike. Even though this was maybe the most challenging, in some ways it was pretty straightforward, right? Once you kind of got everybody on the right page, just because there was such a desire and impetus to do this, right? I mean, how many times, right? We were in meetings, Nick and I probably and Patrick were in meetings when we kind of knew this was going on and we couldn't say anything and wanted to say something, and now we can because it took that long to get it done, but it was a labor of love in that respect.
No, it's incredible. I mean, this is huge industry news, and I think it's going to represent an inflection point in the field as a whole. So,
Nick,
should we do
anything to add, Nick? Sorry.
Yeah, no, not really. It's all about being open and getting the participation and input so that it serves the people who need to use it.
Sorry, Patrick, go ahead.
No, I was just going to do a last call for the official meeting for any questions for Guy or Nick, or if there are any other topics before we go into water cooler.
Do you think it would be worth having a common set of sample assets? So you have some AOUSD sample models or sample assets, and you have the corresponding glTF ones, and you can sort of I'm realizing as I'm saying this now, I'm realizing people are going to see that and they're immediately going to try and compare which one is quote unquote better. But this would be more for the sake of trying to figure out, like, trying to show the integration, right?
Right.
And trying to show how well the integration works.
Yeah, and Ed, you've kind of hit up on a point here, right? Which is that there's been some work from within this group about what would be the round tripping demo, right, between glTF to USD.
Yeah.
And obviously, you folks at glTF and Kronos have some great assets for that. I can imagine that there should be some of those shared assets, and then you kind of have to ask the larger question of, and that David's on the line, does DPEL, right, does digital production example library play a role in this? So I think that's a really interesting question, and it's one that we could definitely figure out where those assets should live, and or should they live in multiple places, and we just have a great collaboration on how to build assets to answer that question. And I saw Neil pop up too, so Neil probably has Well, no, to say about that.
No, I agree totally with what you're saying, Guy. And Ed, you beat me. I was just about to put my hand up with the question. My question was, no, it's very closely related. We have been talking about the round tripping project, and as Nick was saying, obviously when we have a USD spec, it's going to be easier. I guess my question was just confirming my presumption, which is we shouldn't wait for the spec to continue with the round tripping project.
Oh, no, absolutely not.
We should dive in and hopefully, that'll produce some data that hopefully will be useful in the specification process. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. No. Thank you for bringing that up, Neil. I definitely, and Nick will probably back me up on this. I definitely don't want to say, okay, everyone has to stop everything they're doing until we have a normative spec, right? That's not the case. We've got to do a lot of this in parallel.
Right. Yeah, that's good.
And I'm just going to take a second to call out community efforts on this front. The Academy Software Foundation has got a USD working group on assets that has a sizable collection at this point of assets that have just gone through a check and validation pass this week. And a really interesting thing that you'll find there is that a lot of the glTF conformance assets like materials and other things like animated things and shape morphs are represented as transliterations and comparisons between glTF and USD. So you can find like the standard transmittance chart in various formats and then representatively displayed in a 3JS viewer, as well as using an RTX ray tracer in Omniverse, etc. So there's a fair bit of that. And in the general community, I'll just quickly pop up something on my screen here, which is, here's a thing that just landed, which is an independent implementation at a site that you can see the URL up here, asset-explorer.needles.tools. This company, Needle, has got a whole bunch of assets that are available in glTF, Collada, and USD. So you can, for example, bring up, I don't know, this one's good, the alpha blend test mode. And the fellow who put this together has gone to all the trouble of showing how the test works. Like, this is right out of the Chrono set. This is how the test works. And here's like some common problems that you can see. There's a whole lot of information here that's very interesting. And we can go and have a look at, like, say, this wicker shape. So here's a clear coat wicker that he's picked it because it highlights a difference between the USD preview surface and the glTF PBR. And so he just goes and says, well, the glTF surface has got a separate set of normals. And he explains that we can't represent. Yes. He explains that we can't represent that in USD preview surface because it doesn't have a second set of normals. And then there's all these different ways to look at it to see the issue. So it's fun to see these. It's fun to see these efforts and the degree that everybody really cares about these problems.
Yeah, the Needle folks are pretty awesome. I mean, I missed the last call, I think, Patrick. I mean, our schedule here at the forum, we're going to have some bandwidth to start doing some collation on this kind of, get some bandwidth going into that round tripping project. Because I think, collating all the various sources around the industry for assets and tests and doing inventorying and then figuring out how we can best work together will be, I think, seems like it would be super valuable.
Yeah, I agree.
Do we have meeting time on our schedule?
We should add it.
Yeah.
No, I think this group collectively could add a lot of value, kind of helping to find and fill those nooks and crannies. So yeah. We'll make sure to get some bandwidth for it.
Yeah.
Other topics for Guy and Nick, or anything else for the official meeting?
Is AOUSD part of the forum, or do they have a liaison relationship, or is it in progress?
With MSF?
Yes.
Lee, as not part of the forum, we're trying to get the Kronos one done, and Neil and I are going to talk about the MSF as well. I don't foresee an issue. We're literally just trying to kind of work through some of the paperwork things with our legal committee at AOUSD to get that done. But I can't see a situation where there wouldn't be a liaison relationship there. That's a TBD though for Neil and myself to kind of help shepherd that. Neil, do you want to add anything to that?
No, it will be totally awesome to have the Alliance as a forum member, so we can continue the good cooperation. I don't see a barrier to the way the Alliance is structured to joining, but obviously that's in the end it's up to the Alliance. But yeah, I definitely hope that would happen.
Cool.
But in the meantime, we have enough common members. We can keep the threads going. But
yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of that really just for one final point on that, a lot of that is just making sure that we have what's necessary for specifically on the Chrono side and ASWF, the IP structure set up, right? I mean, we want to make sure that that is easy. If something great comes out in one of those and it needs to be part of the spec, we want to make sure the IP part is clean. As much as a sort of recovering engineer, I don't like to think about the IP stuff. It is important. We need to make sure that that's taken care of.
Well, at the forum, of course, there is no IP.
Right. Well, so, exactly. I mean, so MSF it's a different beast, but Kronos and ASWF are different.